All right, what we've got here is we're looking at the final years of the war, 64 and 65. So we have a number of different campaigns that we're going to take a look at in these last 2 years of the war. Any idea what we have going on in this particular picture?
Surrender.
It's surrender, yeah. These are Union soldiers standing beside what are known as guard trees. And that's when you form your weapons up in what is called a guard tree, leaning them against one another. And that is outside Appomattox Courthouse. So this is Union soldiers at the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. All right, so I've got a map for you here. This is just what the war looked, or the nations, these two nations looked like at the start of the war. So the shaded, almost sort of like pink is Union control. We obviously have the blockade, which we would call the what? What do we call that blockade? That was developed by Winfield Scott. Anaconda Plan. Okay, so if we move into the we take a look here at the map on the border of Virginia and West Virginia. Remember, West Virginia secedes, so there's going to be federal occupation here, some federal occupation along the coastline, but most of the Confederate states in 61 were in the hands of the Confederacy. By 62, we have some pockets. Northern Virginia on the border of Maryland, eastern North Carolina, South Carolina, Beaufort, northern Georgia, both east and west. And then we talked about Farragut taking New Orleans, and then obviously Tennessee at the hands of Grant, Henry, Donelson, Shiloh, Corinth. And then we move into 63. The blockade has been tightened. All of West Tennessee has fallen. And then the sort of dotted area is that essentially control of the Mississippi has now exploited these regions of the Confederacy. So you've got Nathaniel Banks, who's going to ultimately end up leading a trans-Mississippian campaign in 64 that we're going to start our lesson with. And then we have tightening grip along the coastal fortifications. There is one area, Mobile Bay, Alabama, that we're going to talk about today as well. And then you see that the areas of the East Coast that blockade into 63 became tightened as well. So we're moving into 64 now. So we have really a lack of unity and supply in the South. There's a lot of opposition against the Confederate government by 1864. Internal problems, local and state governments are sparring with the Confederate government. The food situation had never really been that good, and now it was in really bad shape. We'd seen bread riots in 1863 in cities like Macon, Atlanta, and Augusta, Georgia, sort of like the French Revolution. The largest of the bread riots occurred in Richmond, where not only bakeries, but shops, jewelry stores, and other businesses were raided and robbed by women in Richmond. It had to actually be stopped by our militia at the command of Jefferson Davis himself. Southerners obviously resisted the Confederate government by evading taxes, dodging the draft, jumping substitute contracts, deserting from the Army. We talked about the Sisson Gang. We talked about the Free State of Jones and the Jones Kingdom when we learned about desertion. Obviously, there's call for peace following the Confederate defeat at Vicksburg and Gettysburg. Senators from North Carolina like William Holden, Joseph Brown of Georgia, and even Vice President Alexander Stephens wanted to move toward peace agreements and toward a resolution in the war. The 1863 Confederate congressional elections hurt Davis as well. He lost a lot of his supporters in the Confederate Congress. And then obviously there's other issues of sabotage like Home Guard and border wars that were being fought on the border of Virginia, West Virginia, Missouri, Kansas, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And there's also a problem with people just sort of being lured by the highest bidder, because people are starving, the war is dragging on, and they want to be able to make a dollar. We talked about the Sissons Gang in Floyd County. So this is a sketch of the Richmond bread riots that occurred on April 2nd in 1863. So Grant gains full command of the Union Army on March 12, 1864. He's actually brought to Washington, and he comes into the White House, and Lincoln's trying to introduce him to this crowd of people that are excited to see him. Grant's about my height. He's like 5'7", not a really tall guy. So they actually put him up on a couch so everybody can see him in this particular meeting where politicians and other generals want to meet Grant for the first time. So Sherman is going to gain command of forces in the Western Theater, and he is going to launch what becomes known as the Atlanta Campaign out of Chattanooga. Grant moves his headquarters to Virginia. So here's essentially the plan. We have Grant, Henry Halleck, obviously still political advisor to Lincoln, and then Lincoln, what's the plan? Take on Lee and try to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia in Northern Virginia. Follow up on what Meade has not really done, and that is hit Lee with an offensive following up on Gettysburg. So Grant, Meade, and Benjamin Butler in the east. Attack on the Shenandoah Valley, led by Franz Sigel, Philip Sheridan, and David Hunter. Hunter will ultimately replace Sigel in command, and Sheridan essentially has his own cavalry unit that he will launch raids with. Invade Georgia, Sherman and James B. McPherson, and then attack Louisiana in what is called the Trans-Mississippi Campaign to try to take out the Trans-Mississippi HQ in Shreveport, Louisiana, and to also try to keep the French from intervening in the war out of Mexico. Furthermore, to take Mobile Bay, Alabama. This is the last major port in the Gulf of Mexico that's in Confederate hands. This will be led by Nathaniel P. Banks, that we've talked about before, all the way back in the Valley Campaign in 1862. And then, of course, David Farragut. He's the highest-ranking admiral in the Union Navy. We talked about his victory at New Orleans. So these are just the locations of the generals in 1864. So Grant commanding all armies now. We have Franz Sigel here in the valley, Meade in the east, the Beast, Benjamin Butler in the east, Sherman in the Atlanta Campaign, and then Banks in what is known as the Red River Campaign in Louisiana. And then down here, I probably should have added, this is Farragut in Mobile Bay down here in Alabama. So let's talk a little bit about the Red River Campaign. This is fought from March to May of 1864. This is really Halleck's plan that was supported by Lincoln. They were worried about French control of Mexico and that the French might ally with the Confederacy and Texas. I believe I talked a little bit about this. Napoleon III had sent the Emperor Maximilian to conquer Mexico City. So there was a fear that there might be a foreign intervention. And if there's a foreign intervention, well, that would bode not so well for the Union, because to keep the Confederates as a belligerent and not a recognized nation is what Lincoln wanted. Nathaniel Banks leads an army of about 30,000, 15,000 of which are Sherman's men, along really what is a goal of gaining control of Shreveport. Shreveport's important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's the capital of Louisiana. And number two, it is also the headquarters for the Confederate Trans-Mississippi Theater, which was commanded by General Kirby Smith. So there are a couple of battles here. The Battle of Mansfield, also known as Sabine Crossroads, fought on April 7th to 8th. Banks moved his way toward the river near Mansfield, Louisiana. He was met by 15,000 Confederates under Kirby Smith and Richard Taylor. This is one of John Tyler's 15 kids. The Confederates win this battle. Not a really high casualty report, high for that particular theater of war. And then the Battle of Pleasant Hill in Louisiana fought on April 9th. Tactical victory for the Union, but no real value. Banks ordered a retreat from Pleasant Hill. David Dixon Porter's gunboats couldn't move. They actually had to dam up the river to be able to get his boats out of there. And again, the soldiers had to really pretty much abandon the plan to take control of Shreveport. So here we have Nathaniel Banks, David Dixon Porter, Kirby Smith, and son of John Tyler, General Tyler, and I'm sorry, yeah. So we've got Shreveport. They're gonna Smith and Tyler are gonna hold. Banks, Porter are gonna ultimately fall back, but Louisiana still is in the hands of is going to be in the hands of New Orleans is still going to be in the hands of Union forces. So we have the massacre at Fort Pillow. This was fought on April 12, 1864. Fort Pillow was mainly controlled by Union infantry and Union African American cavalry. The 6 U.S. colored artillery units. The fort was raided by Nathan Bedford Forrest, and Forrest is going to order his men to kill all of the African Americans that are trying to surrender at this particular battle. It's one of the worst events of the war. It also has some pretty major consequences, because following the massacre at Fort Pillow, previously there had been a prisoner exchange between Union and Confederates, and now the prisoner exchange ground to a screeching halt. So Grant sort of used this as like, all right, well, if you're not going to respect the African American soldiers, then you're not going to gain the support of the you're not going to gain the support of the Union in getting Confederate soldiers back. Therefore, the Confederacy tightened its reins on its treatment of Union prisoners of war. So a lot of the soldiers that actually died at places like Andersonville may have actually ended up being exchanged if this particular massacre and order would have never taken place. So it's kind of like a weird and very tragic chain reaction of events. It was a horrible massacre of African American soldiers, but it ultimately and ironically led to the death of even more Union soldiers in these prison camps. Here we have the Fort Pillow Massacre. In the Eastern Theater, this is the Bristow and Mill Run campaign. This is a really small campaign of not real large battles, but mainly a small set of skirmishes. Following Gettysburg, Lee retreats back across the Potomac. Meade plans a new set of offenses, but the old snapping turtle, as his troops called him, was slow to move. He's widely criticized for basically being like McClellan all over again in the mind of Lincoln. This campaign is a series of inconclusive battles and skirmishes from October 9th through November 9th of 1863. Lee and Meade skirmished in a number of small battles like the Battle of Bristow Station, the Battle of Auburn, the Second Battle of Rappahannock Station, and the Battle of Buckland Mills. This is all in and around Loudoun County, Virginia, and Fauquier County, Virginia. I don't know if you're familiar with that area. It's basically the exact same area where the staging ground was near Culpeper, Virginia, before Lee's march toward Gettysburg. So here is your area. This is the engagements in the Bristow campaign. And this is ultimately what leads Meade to be removed from command and to be replaced with Grant. So begins the Overland Campaign. You may want to have that review out to knock down a few of the terms from the review. So we have, this is being fought May through June of 1864. So Grant now has command from Meade in the east. On May 2nd, Grant's Army of the Potomac crosses the Rapidan River in 3 places. Grant's plan: push through the wilderness, fight Lee on open ground, and essentially defeat the Army of Northern Virginia and force Lee's army into surrender. Lee's plan: use the wilderness to offset the small numbers and his inferior artillery, because remember, coming out of Gettysburg, the Confederate artillery was running way low on supply. Lee's strength, 61,000. Grant's strength, 101,000, and that's not even with reinforcements. So on May 5th, Richard Ewell on the left flank, A.P. Hill on the right, and Lee engages the Union Army. So remember, Lee's army broken up into 3 corps. Longstreet, the first corps, he's going to be pulled back from west back to the east. Ewell with the second corps, and Hill with the third corps. The first of these battles is the Battle of the Wilderness. The Battle of the Wilderness is fought May 5th through 7th, 1864. This is the exact battleground that was fought during the Battle of Chancellorsville. All right? So it's almost exactly 1 year, and just a few days, or a year later, that this battle is going to take place. Fought in dense forest. It was very dry, and the cannon fire and the fighting and the absolute chaos of this battle and the dense forest caused forest fires throughout the fighting. So there not only was the battle lines disrupted due to the dense forest, but the battle lines were also disrupted due to the forest fires and the smoke throughout the battlefield. A lot of soldiers actually died of smoke inhalation during this particular battle. There is a really interesting film that was done based on this battle. It's called Wicked Spring, and I'll explain it later. It's worth your time. It's an independent film. It's worth checking out about the Battle of the Wilderness. Lee actually attempted a charge himself to break through the line, but his men actually stopped him. One common soldier, just a buck private, grabbed the reins of his horse and said, "Generally, you can't charge into the field. You got to fall to the back." Longstreet, again, wounded in this particular battle by friendly fire. It was almost like, a year later what had happened with Jackson. And the casualties were heavy. Over 18,000 Union missing, killed, wounded, and over 11,000 Confederate missing, killed, wounded in the Battle of the Wilderness. So what I've got here for you is just some images. So on the top left here, this is the area of Chancellorsville and in and around where this battlefield was and currently still is. That forest is still very dense. This is a group of, this is like a reunion of the Battle of the Wilderness. Image taken of soldiers that came back to the battlefield. This is a marker at Tabb's farm where Lee tried to lead the charge, and it says, "Lee to the rear, cried the Texans, May 6, 1864. And this is the area in which Lee was trying to lead that particular charge. All right, another one you might want to take a look at for your review is the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse in the Overland Campaign, May 8th through May 21st. After the Wilderness, Grant moved around Lee's right flank, heading south. Lee anticipated the movement, sent forces to intercept Grant. The fighting took place north of Spotsylvania Courthouse. This right here was known as the Mule Shoe. This location, the Mule Shoe, was the most heavily fortified breastworks and trenches that the Confederates had dug, and it led to the Bloody Angle. The Bloody Angle, brutal fighting. This is where the Union were beaten back. So you probably are thinking, well, didn't we already talk about a Bloody Angle at the center of the line at Gettysburg? Well, yeah, this was the Bloody Angle at the Mule Shoe at Spotsylvania Courthouse. This was one of the costliest battles for the Union Army in the entire war. 18,000 Union missing, killed, wounded, 12,000 Confederate. And this then leads to the Battle of North Anna in the Overland Campaign. In between, or during the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, cavalry units led by Jeb Stuart and Philip Sheridan are doing screening movements outside Mechanicsville, not far from Spotsylvania Courthouse. Sheridan's Union cavalry clashes with Stuart's cavalry, and on May 11th, Stuart will be wounded. He'll be rushed by ambulance to Dr. Charles Brewer's house, which is now I think it's the 2nd Police Precinct in Richmond down on Gray Street, where Stuart will die of his wounds. Stuart dies on May 12th, 1864. Here we have Philip Sheridan. This is the site on Gray Street of Stuart's death. This is Stuart's plumed cap, his plumed hat, and then this is the marker for Jeb Stuart. Jeb Stuart will be interred or buried at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. And that battle that he was killed at is the Battle of Yellow Tavern outside of Richmond in Henrico. All right. Another one for your review here, the Battle of Cold Harbor, May 31st to June 3rd. Grant was heavily reinforced at this battle in Hanover County. tried to break Lee's armies and move on to Richmond. Confederacy was behind really strong, deep trenches. The battle is a mixture of trench warfare against the old Napoleonic tactics. This is the same location where battles were fought during the Peninsula Campaign. So in 1862, at the Battle of Seven Pines, you still got that shoulder-to-shoulder Napoleonic strategy of fighting in the, fighting with sort of like in a 50-yard range. By 1864, these guys are dug in deep, entrenched in deep breastworks that prevent them from being killed. So not only are the Confederates digging in, but also the Union. The Union is going to launch frontal assaults. The deadliest was on June 3rd. Thousands of the estimate is somewhere between 4,000 to 7,000 Union men were killed within 40 minutes in these frontal assaults on June 3rd. Confederate casualties, less than 5,000. Union casualties, almost 13,000. One Confederate soldier said, "This is not war, this is murder." This was Lee's, really the Army of Northern Virginia's true final victory of the war, even though there will be some inconclusive battles and some little victories like the Battle of the Crater. This was like the last major victory for the Army of Northern Virginia. This is what those trenches look like today. You can still go out onto this battlefield in Hanover County and take a look. I would recommend, if you ever have an opportunity to go hit some of these battlefields in and around Richmond. Yeah. Oh yeah? Cool. And then these are African American grave diggers that are moving the remains of bodies in 1865. So this is like just under a year later in 1865 at the battlefield at Cold Harbor. So fighting in the Overland Campaign continues until June 12th. This is when Grant decides to take Richmond via Petersburg. So we can see here, if you guys follow along with me on the map, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, North Anna, Cold Harbor, and then we're going to head down here to the siege of Petersburg. So Grant's plan is to take Richmond by Petersburg. Remember that defensive lines around both Richmond and defensive lines around Washington, D.C. Those defensive lines and forts had been established for 4 years now. Let's talk a little bit about the 1864 Valley Campaign. The Valley Campaign was led by Franz Sigel, who was commander of the Department of Western Virginia, ordered to move up the valley south with 10,000 men, destroy Railroad Center at Lynchburg, and secure the valley to threaten Lee's flank. This leads to the Battle of Newmarket on May 15th, 1864. Sigel's met by 4,000 soldiers and cadets from the Virginia Military Institute. These cadets had marched over 80 miles in 4 days to join John C. Breckinridge. He gives the order, "Put the boys in, and may God forgive me for the order." Most were first-year cadets, 16 to 19 years old. They were led by 24-year-old Scott Shipp, who had risen to the rank of lieutenant colonel. And the battle took place at Bush Hog Farm. Confederates charged over the rail fence, up the muddy slope. This became known as the Field of Lost Shoes, and they took the Union artillery at the top of the hill. At the end of the day, and really by several days later, a total of 10 cadets would lose their lives as a result of the battle. Sigel was defeated. He pulled back. He was replaced by General Major General David Hunter. Hunter then raids the valley in the Battle of the Piedmont, fought June 5th to 6th. He resumed the offensive, took Stanton, Virginia. Forces under Breckinridge retreat to Lynchburg. Jubal Early launches a Jackson-like campaign in the Valley of Virginia, and then Philip Sheridan's cavalry will wage total war against Early in the valley from the summer to the fall of 1864. Hunter later burns VMI, old barracks, and a couple of professors' homes to the ground on June 12th. Cadets will then retreat to Lynchburg, and then will be sent, the cadets that are left will be sent to Richmond to take up their training and classes at the Alms House in Richmond. This is a really famous mural of the battle in Newmarket. This mural is painted in Jackson Memorial Hall at the Virginia Military Institute. And then this is Nichols Engineering Building at the Virginia Military Institute. It sits right next to Jackson Memorial Hall. And then this is a statue entitled Lady Virginia Mourning Her Dead. It's sculpted by a very famous American sculptor by the name of Moses Ezekiel. He's actually knighted, Sir Moses Ezekiel. Interesting history about him. He served in the Battle of Newmarket. He was a cadet at VMI. He was actually the first Jewish cadet to attend and graduate from VMI. And he becomes a famous American artist and sculptor. He has other statues that he sculpted at VMI as well, Jackson statue being one of them. 6 of the 10 Newmarket cadets are buried behind the statue on post at VMI. And May 15th is a day in which the Virginia Military Institute remembers those 10 cadets that died as a result of the battle. Let's talk a little bit about Jubal Early's raid. Early's raid is basically a Stonewall Jackson-esque raid on the valley. It leads to the Battle of Lynchburg. Hunter tries to move on Lynchburg to destroy rail lines, canals, and hospitals. Early advances his units and drives them out. Hunter retreats back through West Virginia. This was actually pretty near and dear to Early. Jubal Early was born in Franklin County, Virginia, but he resided in Lynchburg. Early continues to drive Union forces out of the Shenandoah Valley, ordered his cavalry to ride at Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, burn the city to the ground in response to Hunter's raid on the valley. He actually scraped enough soldiers together to approach Washington and lead a raid on the capital. The Battle of Monocacy was the only success outside of D.C. Ultimately, he was stopped at the Battle of Fort Stevens. Do keep in mind, I don't know if you all realize this, there were over 70 fortifications in and around Washington by the end of the war. So it was heavily fortified, and it wasn't going to be easy for a small Confederate force to break into the city. Grant then creates the Department of the Shenandoah to stop Early in the valley. It's headed by Philip Sheridan, in charge with orders to find and destroy Early. He's the guy that I told you at the Battle of Lookout Mountain, he tipped back the whiskey and toasted to the guys on top of the mountain, and they shot at him, so he said, "I'm going to take your artillery for that." That's Phil Sheridan. Sheridan plans to burn the Shenandoah Valley like Sherman in Georgia. So he will famously say, if a crow intends to fly in the Shenandoah Valley, he better carry his own provisions. Sheridan's ride on his war horse, Ramsey, at the Battle of Cedar Creek in October, rallied his men, and pushed Early out of the valley. So here we have the map of Early's raid: Richmond to Charlottesville, Charlottesville to Lynchburg, and then he makes his way north or down the valley, and then an assault on Washington. You see just north of Washington, Fort Stevens. There's Jubal Early on the top right. There's Philip Sheridan on the bottom right. This is Sheridan on his war horse. His men, as a result of this rally at the Battle of Cedar Creek, his men were chanting, "Sheridan, Sheridan," and he said, "Quit yelling my name and fight." So he turns the tide of the battle himself in this particular campaign in the war. And that takes us to the siege of Petersburg, June of 1864 to April of 1865. Lee has Beauregard with about a little over 2,000 men, thinly defending the city of Petersburg. They were mainly dug into these deep trenches all around the city of Petersburg. Lee thought Grant's next move was going to be on Richmond. So Beauregard defends the city in like John B. Magruder style: thin lines, Quaker cannons, a lot of troop movements, campfires all over the place, false encampments, and he actually tricks General Baldy Smith, who fell for fake fortifications around the city. This gave Lee time to reinforce Beauregard. So now Grant lays siege to Petersburg. Grant's going to be supplied through City Point and Hopewell. It actually became one of the largest ports in the world in 1864. The Battle of the Crater was fought on July 30th. This is actually one of the more interesting attempts to break the Confederate lines. Essentially, Burnside, who was the Corps commander, went for this plan. A group of Pennsylvania coal miners decided it would be a really good idea to dig a long tunnel underneath the Confederate lines, and they created a ventilation system to where the miners could breathe and continue to work. They kept a lot of false campfires going to try to distract the Confederacy from the work that they were doing. What the Union didn't realize is that the Confederates had their own miners doing the same thing, just 10 feet above them. So they're both digging tunnels each way to do the same thing. This is when things go horribly wrong. They get into the Confederate line, they fill it full of explosives, they detonate it, it blows up. A lot of Confederates that are on the line will be killed or wounded as a result, but the command and the discipline of the Union soldiers, and really the confusion of the entire event, led to an absolutely horrific defeat for the Union Army. Soldiers were sent in, wave after wave after wave, into the crater. Well, we all know what kind of soil is around this part of the state. This was when the crater blew up, and it created this massive hole by the explosives. When men ran into the crater, they couldn't get back out because the soil it wasn't hard enough for them to climb back out. So the only way for them to get out was to actually have people pull them out. So as more and more Union soldiers start to get in, the Confederates reorganize and just manage to line themselves all the way around the crater and just fire down into the crater. These guys are trying to surrender. A lot of them are African American soldiers, and there's a really famous quote where Confederates yelling down, "Why don't you all surrender?" And somebody yells back, "Why don't you let us?" So this particular event is really a little bit of a turning point in the siege of Petersburg, because if done properly, this particular event may have broken the line for Grant that he needed, but it was botched in such a way that the siege just continues for another 8 months. Burnside loses his corps command. He's not going to regain the command after this one. And the Battle of the Crater is considered by Grant the saddest thing that he had seen during the war. Here we have Union soldiers encamped outside of Petersburg. This is the Battle of the Crater. See the explosion on the Confederate line, but then Billy Mahone, he's going to send his reinforcements in, and they're just going to align themselves around the crater here. And as more and more U.S. colored troops file into the crater, they're just going to completely, it's murder. It's sad. Tragic event. Here are the trenches in and around Petersburg. And then we have the March to the Sea in the Western Theater. So we've got Sherman in the Atlanta campaign. The goal is to take Atlanta. Atlanta has obviously got a lot going on for it. Yeah, what's up? Yeah, of course. We got Atlanta's got it's a capital, it's a railhead, and it is a manufacturing center for the Confederacy. So the goal is take Atlanta, and then from Atlanta, march to Savannah. And this is what Sherman will do. He launches this assault from Chattanooga. Joe Johnston will fall back into defensive position and retreat. Sherman attempts to outflank him, and then Johnston retreats again. This pattern repeats several times. Sherman is beyond frustrated because he knows Johnston is going to be cautious. Davis is even angrier, so he actually removes Johnston with John Bell Hood. Well, Sherman's delighted. He knows Hood's going to attack him. He also knows Hood has not had a command that large. Hood hasn't even had a corps command. He served under Longstreet in the Army of Northern Virginia. So Hood takes the command, and he does launch an attack at Peachtree Creek on July 20th. Hood's attack fails, heavy Confederate casualties, and Hood falls back into Atlanta. This is the Atlanta campaign, city of Atlanta. Ultimately, what's going to happen here, the way that Sherman is going to break into Atlanta is near Ezra Church here. But there's a major loss for the Union during this particular campaign, and that's the loss of McPherson. He'll be killed in the Battle of Atlanta on July 22nd. So the Battle of Atlanta, Union victory, but the loss of McPherson. Sherman settles in for a siege of Atlanta, shells the civilian population, raids the city, breaks off the supply line from Macon, captures the railroad from Macon, exposes Hood's flank southwest of the city, and Hood pulls his troops out of Atlanta, and all supply depots are destroyed. On November 11th, Atlanta burns to the ground. Conflicting reports: did Sherman burn it? Did the Confederates burn it? This is still one of those historical debates that continues. So Hood leaves the Atlanta campaign with only 30,000 troops left. Johnston regains command from Hood. Hood takes a force to try to regain control of Nashville, but he'll be stopped by George Thomas in the Battle of Nashville on December 15th and 16th. Nearly all of Hood's forces are destroyed in that particular campaign. Something I want to point out, we have Sherman here on the top right, and then we have Union soldiers breaking up rail lines outside of Atlanta. Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. The Battle of Mobile Bay was launched on May 5th. by Rear Admiral David Farragut against Confederate Admiral Franklin Buchanan. Do keep in mind, the Confederacy has all wooden ships in this particular battle with the exception of the CSS Tennessee. The torpedoes in this situation are are mines, a minefield in Mobile Bay that Farragut's saying, you know, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. He suffered from vertigo, so they actually lashed him and tethered him to his own mast. So he's like tied up and on his flagship. He sends his ironclads through the minefield. He only loses one ironclad that day. Do keep in mind though, torpedoes were also used on torpedo boats like the David and the Hunley. The David actually made it to the end of the war. The Hunley, it was a submarine, so yeah, it didn't work out for the Confederacy. They launched it in '63, and it sunk and killed its entire crew by '64. Yeah?
The Union had some submarine too. I think they had a couple ones to Alligator, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, you're right.
And I know in the Revolutionary War they had the turtle.
The turtle, yeah. That did not work out. So, yeah, the David actually had a successful torpedo mission in Charleston Harbor in '63. So Farragut and his men are going to break through. The CSS Tennessee actually tries to take on the entire fleet. That doesn't work out. And Farragut and the Union take control of Mobile Bay, and this, much like Sherman's victory in the Atlanta campaign, helps Lincoln get reelected in '64. Here we have the victory at Mobile Bay. There's Farragut up against the mast. There's a really funny sketch of him tied to the mast. There's what a torpedo looked like during the Civil War on the bottom left. And then there's Mobile Bay over there on the right. Remember, he was the guy that joined the Navy at the age of 9. So yeah, you weren't doing that now. That's the David above. That's what a minefield looked like in a harbor. That's the Hunley, the Confederate submarine. And then they found the Hunley, and now it's in a museum, been refurbished down in Charleston. All right, so Sherman's march to the sea, scorched earth principle, burn crops, kill livestock, consume supplies, destroy the civilian infrastructure, destroy all railroads. They call them Sherman neckties because they heated them up and twisted them around trees. Increased the pressure on Lee and Petersburg. 62,000 men marched to Savannah, 40 to 50 miles wide. Inflicted $100 million in property damage. No. That would be pretty wild to calculate. Be in the billions. Sherman captured Savannah, sent message to Lincoln that he had gotten Savannah for him for Christmas. Sherman then marches on toward the Carolinas. He'll burn Columbia, South Carolina to the ground. That's another one that's up for debate on who burned it. So here we go. Let's follow Sherman. Chattanooga to Atlanta, Atlanta to Savannah, Savannah to Columbia. There's always debate on why does Sherman spare Charleston? Is it because he had ties to Charleston? Probably not. He did have some ties to Charleston. It had more to do with the fact that it was not on the way to Richmond. And the rail lines to Charleston had already been completely ripped up by the Union. Therefore, Charleston was imploding on itself. Sherman then captures Columbia, as I mentioned. He will meet Joe Johnston's army in the Tennessee outside of Bentonville, North Carolina. And at Bennett Place near Durham, North Carolina, Johnston will surrender just under 2 weeks after, or just 2 weeks after Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Davis did not want him to surrender. Johnston ignored Davis's instructions. It's another major Confederate surrender. It's not the last, though. Kirby Smith surrendered at Palomita Ranch, Texas, on May 26th near Galveston. There's also some Confederate Navy that didn't realize the war was over after the fact either. So, Atlanta, Savannah, Savannah, Columbia, Columbia, and then here is Bentonville, Goldsboro, Raleigh, and the surrender outside of Bentonville. You've probably passed Bentonville battlefield many times. So now we see what the map looks like in 64. And now let's take a look at Lee's retreat. Petersburg is under siege until April 2nd. Grant continues to extend his lines west around the bottom of the city. Lee responds with a really thinly manned line. The Battle of Five Forks on April 1st, 1865, forces Lee to abandon Petersburg and Richmond. Pickett was at a shad bake behind where the battle started. Confederate forces are defeated by Phil Sheridan's cavalry at the Battle of Five Forks. Here we have Pickett, Sheridan, George Armstrong Custer. Jefferson Davis flees to Danville, Virginia. That was the Confederate capital from April 30th to the 10th. He then flees to Georgia before he's caught and will be held as a prisoner of war. Large parts of the city were destroyed. Richmond, the Confederates set fire to Richmond. Lincoln then came to visit Richmond. Lee heads west, hopes to be resupplied in Lynchburg and link up with Joseph E. Johnston, but stopped at Appomattox Courthouse. He attempted to break through the Union cavalry blocking the way, but it was reinforced with 2 Union corps. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was trapped. He met Grant on April 9th in Wilbur McLean's parlor room to discuss the surrender. Johnston surrenders a couple weeks later to Sherman, and then Kirby Smith surrenders a month later at Palomita Ranch. This is Richmond after it was burnt by Confederates in early April. This is the Overland Campaign all the way to Appomattox. This is Wilbur McLean's house at Appomattox. A painting of the surrender. And then sort of the final days, Davis escaped to Danville. The Confederate cabinet sort of split up. Some of them took off in their own separate ways. Some of them joined him. Lincoln, when he arrived in Richmond 40 hours after Davis's departure, sat in Davis's office in the White House of the Confederacy. On April 12th, Lee's orders of surrender were announced and passed around. Davis issued his last official proclamation in Greensboro, North Carolina, but he was trying to flee to Havana, Cuba, but was captured in Georgia, and he was actually had his wife's overcoat over his shoulders, attempting to flee Union soldiers. So this led to caricatures of him being disguised as a woman trying to flee to Cuba. So it says, a proper family reunion, treason today. We have Benedict Arnold, the devil, and Jefferson Davis appear to be dressed in his wife's clothing.
Why does it say 1863?
1865. It looks like a 3, but the snake's head's covering it. Treason toddy, yes, meaning a cocktail. Treason toddy, treason cocktail. So it did look like today, didn't it? Treason toddy, good pickup there. So historical interpretations, Southern historians, the idea of the lost cause, that the Confederacy went from what was real to a state of mind, and that state of mind continues through Jim Crow in the post-Reconstruction era. The South waged the war in defense of a genteel, non-competitive agrarian society with the peculiar institution of slavery, defending the homeland against the Yankee invader, defeated by the brute force of Northern numbers and weapons, not skill, portrayed the Confederacy's cause as noble, and most of the Confederacy's leaders as exemplary and exemplars of old-fashioned chivalry, resentment toward Reconstruction, which is where we're moving on to next, and then obviously political causes, strict reading of the federal Constitution, a second American Revolution, and resistance to the centralization and the power of the national government. And then your northern historical perspective, the moral crusade against slavery, industrial progress, a war to preserve the Union, binding up the nation's wounds with malice toward none, charity for all, caused by the wicked ambitions of the slave power and conspiracy to subvert America's Republican virtue. And there is one place where we can look at the sort of the beginning of the lost cause, and that would be the unveiling of Lee's statue on Monument Avenue, or what will become Monument Avenue, on May 29th, 1890, Richmond, Virginia. This is honestly not a new theory. It's come into the forefront in recent years, but it's really been the theory of the start of the lost cause. Truly began with Governor Fitzhugh Lee in 1890 wanting to commemorate his uncle and commemorate other fallen Confederate heroes in Richmond, Virginia, which will become Monument Avenue. All right. You guys have any questions?